So at this stage, hopefully you've got a really good grasp of what the reaction of photosynthesis is about and that you've got some ideas about plant physiology. Screened up here are all triple statements that we've covered in that first booklet. And before we move into the second booklet, I just ask you to pause the video and go through each one of these syllabus statements and test yourself. Can you out loud explain what each one of these means? Are you comfortable with the terminology that is required for these parts of the syllabus statements? Test yourself, see how you do. So this triple booklet, pages 2 to 5, is going to ask you to review your understanding of those previous syllabus statements. Again, here, I just want to explicitly signpost that this theory should be connected to ideas that you met in year 9 about movement across the cell membrane. So we're looking at active transport, osmosis, diffusion. All these terms should be quite familiar and they should be relevant in context here in this further plant physiology. Also remember that already in year 10 we've covered the idea of aerobic respiration and how plants also do respiration and need oxygen in order to do the respiration process and make ATP. So it's all about connecting ideas. So on pages 2 to 5 of your booklet, you can see the table here is what that looks like to start off with. Check in on your understanding. See how much of that booklet that you can fill in. If you get stuck, go back to your textbook, come back to me with questions, and let's make sure that we embed this understanding. And we're going to move on now to look at other physiological processes, and in particular how water moves through the plant. So we need to think about how water is taken up at the root, how the plant then transports that water in the xylem tissue, and then at the leaf, we need to remind ourselves that water is needed for photosynthesis, but some water also can be lost at the leaf surface, and that's what we're going to look at next. So again, I want you to pause here. I want you to make sure that you are clear about this idea of osmosis and turgid and flaccid cells. Textbooks pages 152 to 155 are worth reading before we move on here. But can you give a definition of osmosis? Okay, this definition, you're really looking for 4 points to make. Can you draw a diagram, label a diagram, and describe aloud what a turgid and a flaccid cell looks like? And can you connect these ideas to that of osmosis? So a reminder then, what osmosis is. It's passive. So there's your first point there. It's a movement of water, which is a passive movement, which means you don't need any extra energy. The other thing here to underscore is that it's a movement of water. Now, ions might be moving, sugars might be moving, but when we're talking about osmosis, we're only focusing on the movement of water. That's your second point. So we've got the passive movement of water. The third point to make is that it has to happen across a cell membrane. So if water is moving and it's not crossing a membrane, it's not osmosis. And then this last point, from a high water potential to a low water potential, is the fourth point. Now let's recap on what water potential means. If you've got a high water potential, that means that the water molecules themselves they have the potential and ease to move very easily. So a high water potential is the same thing as saying a dilute solution. There's not much dissolved in that solution. A low water potential is obviously the opposite, and a low water potential means that the water molecules are not very able to move. They're not free to move, which means that you must have a lot of solute sugar, or something like salt, which is dissolved in that solution. So osmosis is passive, no energy. It's only the movement of water. It's across a cell membrane, and it's down a water potential gradient, or a high water potential to a low water potential. So if you've got a cell which is turgid, as this one is here, what you've got is this idea that osmosis must have taken place and water must have moved into both the vacuole and also into the cytoplasm. That's going to cause the cytoplasm and the vacuole to swell the cell, pushing that cell membrane against the cell wall. Now remember that cellulose is the material that the cell wall is made of, and it's inelastic, it's tough. So there's going to be a point reached where enough water has moved in to push back against that cell wall, and the cell wall pushes in the opposite direction. So we've got what is referred to as a turgid cell. It feels like a balloon that's fully blown up. This cell is also said to be hypertonic. Then what we've got in a flaccid cell is that you've got water which is has moved rather, in both directions. And if you push against this, it's flattened. If you look here, the cell wall is not tight against the cell membrane. So in most cases, what's happened is that the water has been lost, the cytoplasm and the vacuole has shrunk, and that pulls the cell wall away from the cell, it pulls the cell membrane away from the cell wall. So this is kind of a floppy cell. And if you've got lots of cells like this in a stem, then the stem will be said to be wilted. It'll be floppy, but the individual cells are said to be flaccid. So here we've got more water loss, which is not actually so clear on that diagram there. If we've got a lot of water lost, then what will happen is the cell becomes what is referred to as plasmolysed. So the cell is in plasmosis. And here you can see that the cell membrane is pushed right back from the cell wall. So this is really not good. So what we want are cells to be turgid. And in the stem, if all of the cells are turgid, then that stem will be firm and it will be upright. So if it's windy, etc., then that will be supported by the plant. So just to recap on that, and then these are where we're going next. These are the syllabus statements that we need to think about, how water is taken up by the root hair cells. Remember that root hair cells are specialized cells. Understand about transpiration, and we're going to think about the differences between transpiration and the transpirated stream. Then we're going to look at how the rate, remember rate is per unit time, how fast transpiration takes place, and how that relates to this idea of humidity, wind speed, temperature, and light intensity. And there's a practical element here. When we get back to school, you'll be able to see this firsthand, but we're using the potometer to measure the rate of transpiration. So first of all, let's think about what transpiration is. So if we're talking about transpiration, we're specifically talking about water loss from the leaf. And the water is lost from the undersurface of most leaves because this is where the stomata are found. In order for the water to be lost, it's lost as water vapor. So the first thing that must happen is that the cells inside the leaf will have the water evaporated, and then the evaporated water will be, which is basically a gaseous water, is going to diffuse out through the stomata in this direction. So when we're talking about transpiration, we're talking about the loss of water from the leaf surface, and it's the undersurface through the stomata. If we're thinking about the transpirated stream, and think of the idea of a stream, that trickle of water, what we're talking about here is the movement of water into the roots, up through the stem, into the leaf, and then out of the leaf. So the stream is the whole movement of water all the way through the plant, whereas transpiration is specifically focusing at the water which is lost at the leaf surface. So this is just an idea of what's going on here. So we've got the loss of water initially by evaporation in terms of the water as liquid form inside the cells becoming gaseous water, and that gaseous water is going to be in the spongy layer of the leaf. And then because we've got these saturated saturated air pockets within the spongy layer, we're going to get diffusion of water out through the stomata. When we're talking about diffusion, we're talking about the gas. Transpiration stream, remember, is the whole flow of water through the plant. And this diagram is reinforcing what we've already said. In blue, what we can see here is the transpiration stream. And just interesting for you to know, it depends on the climate, but something like 99% of the water that's taken in at the root is going to be lost by transpiration, which is quite a lot. Now, we need to think about how water is able to move up through the plant, and there are two factors that we need to consider. If you've got water which is being lost from the surface of the leaf, that's going to create a pressure up here in the leaf which is lower than the pressure down here. So that negative pressure is going to cause kind of a suction effect of water moving upwards. In addition to that, we need to think about something called the transpiration pull, which depends on the chemistry really of water, and this idea of cohesion and adhesion. And cohesion and adhesion is to do with the properties of individual water molecules, which we're going to have a look at. So have a read through that, just check in that you understand it, and hopefully we'll unpack it a little bit more in the next few slides. So let's have a look at what's going on here. So we've got water inside the soil, And then we've got this here, which is a funny looking cell. This is a specialized cell. It's got an extra long surface area. This is a root hair cell. It's an individual cell. It's a specialized cell. It's specialized because it's got a very, very thin wall. It's different from other plant cells. It has no chloroplast because it's underneath the ground. And what's happening here is water is going to move by osmosis into the cytoplasm of this root hair cell. And it's going to move by osmosis, so we're talking about a passive movement of water down a water potential gradient across this cell membrane. The water will then again move from this root hair cell across to individual cells, again by osmosis, and it's going to eventually find its way into these tubes here. These are called xylem tubes. And xylem is a tissue in a plant, which is an unusual tissue because the xylem tube is hollow. The individual cytoplasm inside will die back. The cell walls between adjacent xylem break down. So what we've got is a hollow tube, which is made up of what once was cells, but are now dead cells. They are totally waterproof on the outside, totally hollow in the middle. And the reason that water moves upwards is because you've got water moving in, causing a high hydrostatic pressure. And remember, we've got water loss here by transpiration, and that water loss here is going to cause a negative pressure. Water in is going to cause a positive pressure, and that's going to push water up, okay, from a high force here to a lower force up there. So that's a hydrostatic pressure, which is going to push water up through the xylem. And then the xylem is going to carry that water into the leaf cells. Some of the water, of course, is used for photosynthesis, and some of it is going to be lost from the leaf by transpiration. This diagram shows you something similar, okay, and it looks at various different tissues here, which you can see which are color-coded. What you need for GCSE is to know that water is taken up through the root hair cell by osmosis. That's this yellow cell here, and then it moves across the cortex by osmosis. We're not really too worried about this cortex, but it's going to go into the xylem, right? Don't worry about the pericycle. You can look at that for extension work if you like, but we've got water moving in by osmosis into the root hair cell. It moves across the cortex of the root and into the xylem by osmosis as well. And here, what we can see is a transverse section of the root. So you've got the individual root hair cells here. This yellow part is the cortex, and then this blue part in the center is the xylem. So water is moving in by osmosis across individual cells here by osmosis, and eventually into this xylem here. This is what it looks like underneath an electron, underneath a light microscope. And this demonstration I'll show you when we go back to school. But if you take a capillary tube, that's a glass tube which is very, very narrow, and you place it in an ink solution, you'll find that it just starts to move up. Now, this is not magic. This is called capillary action. It's because individual water molecules have got a slight charge. So individual water molecules like to stick to one another, but they also like to stick to the xylem, or in this case, the glass tubes. So capillary action describes the way in which water is going to move by adhesion and cohesion up a narrow tube against gravity, which is an unusual property that water has. So when we've got water moving up through the xylem, it moves as a consequence of capillary action. Now, capillary action, you don't have to know too much about this, but that capillary action is going to go up a narrow tube, which in the case of a plant is xylem. For this demonstration, it's glass tube, and it's because of the chemical properties of water, which are adhesion and cohesion. Don't worry too much about this because this is really IB. But you've also got a suction pressure because of the evaporation of water at the surface of the root. And here we can see a transverse section through the stem, and these are individual vascular bundles. And we can again see that what happens is that the root, first of all, if we go back here, is going to take it into the xylem, and then that xylem is going to branch out into the stem to form these individual vascular bundles, and these individual vascular bundles are going to contain xylem, which is the red one on the inside here, and that xylem is going to go run up through the plant. So this is a transverse section through the leaf, and water is moving upwards in these red parts of the tissue here. Here, hopefully you're familiar with already, and here we've got the xylem bringing water into the leaf. Some of this is going to be used for the process of photosynthesis, and then some of it is going to be lost through here by transpiration. And I'm going to make another video to show you more about that in just a second.